From the moment Jack and Lily vanished into thin air, one name kept circling back to the center of every conversation: Daniel Martel. He had been their stepfather for over 2 years. He shared a roof with them, a trailer, a life, and he knew, from the very first day investigators came knocking, that he was in their crosshairs. That kind of pressure breaks people. It bends them, distorts them, forces them into corners where silence or panic become the only options. But Martel didn't go quiet. He didn't lawyer up and disappear behind closed doors. Instead, he did something that surprised nearly everyone watching this case unfold. He opened the door wide and said, "Take everything." His phone, his records, his body language under a polygraph machine. All of it handed over voluntarily, without hesitation. Or at least, that was the story he told. "Let's do everything you can for the kids," he said. And on the surface, that sounds like exactly what an innocent man would say. A desperate man. A man who wants answers just as badly as the rest of the world does. But this case hasn't been about surfaces. It has been about what lies underneath. Beneath the statements, beneath the cooperation, beneath the carefully chosen words of a man who knew cameras were watching. The RCMP didn't take his word for it. They never do. Freshly unsealed court documents pulled back the curtain on just how deep investigators went in pursuit of the truth. They combed through bank records, dissecting every transaction. They pulled phone data, tracking every call, every text, every digital footprint left behind. They cross-referenced GPS location data with the statements Martel and the children's mother, Malia Brooks Murray, gave to police. Every coordinate, every timestamp, every movement in the days leading up to the moment those 2 kids stopped being findable. Because in a case like this, the question isn't just where the children went. It's where every adult was, and whether their story matches the data. By July 16th, investigators had logged something significant in their records. As of that date, they did not believe the case was criminal. That's a headline that gets buried under the noise of public outrage. But it matters enormously, because it means that after weeks of digging, after warrants, after polygraphs, after thousands of hours of investigative labor, the working theory had not yet crossed into the territory of foul play, at least not officially. Not yet. 6 polygraph examinations had been completed by that point. 6. The scope alone tells you how seriously RCMP was casting its net. Brooks Murray sat across from examiners in what police explicitly described as an effort to eliminate her as a suspect in causing her children's disappearance and possible murder. Those words, possible murder, appeared in official documents. Let that land for a moment. The mother of these 2 children was being screened for their potential killing. She passed. Martel passed too. So did his mother. So did Brooks Murray's mother and her partner. Even the children's biological father was polygraphed. Everyone passed. And yet, the children were still gone. The physical search painted a picture of absence that was almost more unsettling than discovery would have been. Investigators combed through Martel's property and swept across 8.5 square kilometers of surrounding land. Cadaver dogs were deployed. Drones swept the skies. Volunteers moved through dense forest and along waterways in organized waves. What came back from all of that effort was achingly thin. A single boot print, matching the size 11 feet of little Lily. A pink blanket, discovered hanging from a branch deep in the trees, found not by investigators but by family members of the children's mother. And then there was the piece of that same blanket pulled from a garbage bin sitting at the end of the family's driveway. Martel had an answer for that one. He said it was the same blanket, that it had been torn apart and thrown out, a mundane explanation for an unsettling coincidence. But the detail that made observers stop cold was this. The garbage bin and the tree where the blanket was found were nearly a kilometer apart. How does a discarded blanket end up hanging in a tree almost a full kilometer from where it was thrown away? That question didn't get a clean answer. RCMP confirmed that Lily's blanket was sent away for forensic analysis. The results have not been made public. Meanwhile, investigators revealed they had already received 740 tips and more than 9,300 videos from the public. And still, the careful, deliberate work of finding Jack and Lily continued. The search was far from over. And neither was the scrutiny on the man at the center of it all. If you know something, anything that could bring Jack and Lily home, contact RCMP immediately. Every detail matters. Every tip counts. Share this video so the right eyes see it. There are moments in a missing persons case when the investigations shift from the woods and the courtrooms into the living room, into the court of public opinion, where millions of eyes become amateur investigators, and every word spoken on camera gets played back in slow motion. The drunk turkey interview with Daniel Martel was one of those moments. It aired in May 2025, and within hours, it had become the most dissected piece of media connected to this case. Not because of what it confirmed, but because of what it suggested, because of what it revealed without ever quite saying. This was not a gotcha moment engineered in a studio. It was a long, meandering conversation. The kind where a subject feels comfortable enough to fill silences, to elaborate, to venture into territory they might have avoided in a formal police setting. And in those unguarded expansions, analysts found patterns worth examining. What did Martel choose to emphasize? What did he circle back to repeatedly, unprompted? What did he gloss over, redirect, or reframe? These are the questions that behavioral analysts, online investigators, and armchair detectives have been wrestling with since the episode dropped. This is not a courtroom. No verdict gets rendered here. But in an active investigation, public narrative matters. It shapes what witnesses remember, what tips come in, and what pressure mounts on investigators to pursue specific threads. So let's walk through it carefully. Let's be honest about what we know, what we don't, and what the evidence actually supports. Because in a case involving two missing children, reckless speculation isn't passion. It's a liability. From the opening moment of the interview, viewers noticed something about Martel's energy. He was calm, measured, almost patient in the face of questions that would have rattled most people. He expressed cooperation freely and often, volunteering that he'd handed over his phone, passed a polygraph, invited full searches. He praised investigators. He appealed to the public for understanding. He framed himself consistently and deliberately as a man with nothing to hide and everything to lose. Now, and this is critical, that posture is not automatically suspicious. When someone is under relentless public scrutiny, when their name is being dragged through social media with accusations attached to it, a conciliatory, cooperative tone is a rational response. It is the strategy of someone trying to survive a media trial. Many entirely innocent people adopt exactly this approach. Behavioral analysts know this. Investigators know this. But here is also what behavioral analysts know. Repeated insistence on cooperation can serve a second function. It can be a rhetorical framework, a way of positioning oneself as a helpful, reasonable party before the difficult questions arrive. It establishes a social contract with the audience. I am being open with you, therefore you should extend me goodwill. Whether Martel was doing this consciously or instinctively, commentators noted the pattern. They logged it, and they waited to see whether it held up under harder questioning. It did not always hold up. When the interviewer began pressing on the specific timeline, the night before the children disappeared, the hours surrounding the morning they were last seen, Martel's language shifted. The confidence softened. Precision gave way to hedging. I think, appeared where a clear recollection should have lived. To my knowledge, replaced direct answers. As far as I recall, was deployed in moments where exact memory should have been sharp, because these were not events from years ago. These were the final hours before his stepchildren disappeared forever. Human memory is imperfect. Trauma scrambles timelines. Stress compresses or distorts the sequence of events in ways that are entirely involuntary and entirely normal. No responsible analyst ignores that reality. But investigators also know this. Vague timing in a public account creates gaps. And gaps, when measured against phone logs, GPS records, alarm timestamps, camera footage, and receipts, either collapse or expand into something more significant. Every hedge Martel offer became a testable claim. Every, I think, became an invitation for documentation to either confirm or contradict. In an investigation already swimming in thousands of video files and hundreds of tips, imprecise public statements don't close questions. They generate new ones. The interviewer wasn't just asking about timelines. She was pressing on specifics that had already surfaced in contradictory public accounts. Who woke up when, where the children were sleeping that night, whether backpacks or shoes were in positions that suggested the children had left on their own. Other household members and court documents had painted a different picture in places. The discrepancies weren't dramatic. They were subtle. But subtle discrepancies in the hours surrounding a child's disappearance are exactly the kind of detail that can crack a case open or seal it shut. The interview had just started to dig, and what it was uncovering was only going to get harder to explain. Don't scroll past this. If this case matters to you, share this video, leave a comment, and help keep the pressure on for Jack and Lily. Subscribe so you don't miss part 3. There's a particular kind of discomfort that settles in when someone's story almost makes sense. Not the discomfort of an obvious lie that's easy to identify and dismiss. This is a discomfort of a narrative that fits together in most places, but phrased at the edges in ways that are just specific enough to notice, just vague enough to explain away. That is where investigators found themselves as they continued pulling at the threads of Daniel Martel's account. And that is where careful viewers found themselves watching the drunk turkey interview play out in real time. The inconsistencies weren't theatrical. They didn't arrive with flashing lights or dramatic pauses. They surfaced quietly, in the gap between one person's recollection and another's, in the space between what Martel said happened and what the timeline suggested was possible. 2 areas in particular became focal points for analysts and investigators, and the growing audience watching this case from the outside. The first was a question of who woke up when. The second was where the children were sleeping on the night before they vanished. These sound like minor domestic details. In an ordinary household, in an ordinary week, they would be, but this was not an ordinary week. These were the final hours before Jack and Lily disappeared from the face of the earth. And in those final hours, every minute of the timeline has weight. Every sequence of events either opens or closes a window of opportunity. Every recollection either aligns with the data or creates friction against it. Martel's version of that night and morning differed, in places, from what other household members had described and from what court documents had begun to suggest. The precise moment each adult last laid eyes on the children, who checked on them and when, whether certain items, backpacks, shoes, clothing, were positioned in ways that were consistent with the children having walked out on their own in the early morning hours. These points were not minor inconsistencies buried in irrelevant testimony. They were the architecture of the timeline. And when the architecture doesn't match across multiple accounts, investigators don't shrug and move on. They go back to the foundation. The tools available to corroborate or contradict those accounts are not vague. Alarm system logs record exact moments doors and windows were triggered. Phone records show which devices were active, where they pinged towers, and at what time. Receipts and transaction records place people at specific locations. Surveillance footage from neighboring properties. Cameras mounted on porches, driveways, rural access roads can capture movement that the people living in those homes never even knew was recorded. Follow-up interviews with neighbors can surface observations that seemed unremarkable at the time, but become significant in context. None of these tools traffics in memory. None of them blur under stress or compress under trauma. They produce timestamps, coordinates, fixed points against which human accounts can be measured, and wherever a human account bends away from those fixed points, investigators have a lead worth pursuing. Then came another layer entirely. One that shifted the conversation away from that single night and into the longer history of this household. Multiple interviewees and school records had begun to surface a pattern that predated the disappearance by months, possibly longer. The children had been chronically absent from school. Repeated absences, documented over time, logged against reported health reasons that were difficult to verify. Concerns about the children's welfare had been noted. Multiple parties had flagged issues around supervision and conditions of the home. In investigative terms, this information doesn't automatically point to criminal conduct. Chronic absenteeism and reported neglect reflect family stressors, financial pressure, mental health challenges, parenting capacity issues that exist across a wide spectrum of households and do not by themselves indicate violence or intent to harm. Child protection agencies may have been involved at various points, and those contacts, those case notes, those professional assessments become part of what investigators call the investigative tapestry. They provide texture, context, A picture of the environment these children were living in before the day they stopped being findable. But for those watching from outside the case, these details raise an uncomfortable question that refused to stay quiet. If concerns have been raised, if flags have been logged, if the welfare of Jack and Lily had already entered the system in some form, what happened to those concerns? Who was responsible for following up? And did anyone? For investigators, the answer to those questions doesn't come from public speculation. It comes from documented records, professional evaluations, and case files held by the agencies involved. Those files exist. They contain information that may be directly relevant to understanding what this household looked like in the months and weeks before the children disappeared. The pattern that was emerging wasn't a single dramatic revelation. It was something quieter and hard to look away from. The slow accumulation of details that, taken together, painted a picture of a household under pressure. A household with a history. A household where two children had been visible to systems designed to protect them. And now those children were gone. This case is still active. If you've seen anything, heard anything, or have information that could help locate Jack and Lily, contact RCMP now and share this video. Because the more people watching, the more pressure stays on for answers. Words are not neutral. They never have been. Every choice a speaker makes, every qualifier inserted, every subject changed, every long anecdote deployed in the place of direct answer, tells a story of its own, not always a story of guilt. Sometimes a story of fear, of grief, of a person so overwhelmed by scrutiny that their language collapses under the weight of it. But sometimes, in cases where timelines matter and children are missing, the language itself becomes evidence. Not courtroom evidence, not the kind that convicts, but the kind that points, that gestures toward threads investigators know they need to pull. Behavioral analysts who reviewed the drunk turkey interview identified 3 distinct verbal tactics appearing throughout Martel's responses. They labeled them clearly: ingratiation, hedging, and diversion. Understanding what each of these looks like in practice, and what they do and don't mean, is essential to reading the interview honestly rather than emotionally. Ingratiation was the most visible of the 3. It showed up consistently as expressions of gratitude directed at investigators. Praise for the RCMP's efforts, acknowledgement of how hard the search teams were working, appeals to the community for patience and calm. On its surface, this is gracious. It is what a cooperative subject sounds like, but analysts noted the frequency and the timing of these expressions. They didn't appear only when the conversation turned to search efforts. They surfaced repeatedly, often immediately before or after question that required Martel to be specific about his own actions or whereabouts. The effect, whether intentional or not, was to reframe the exchange, to position him not as a subject under scrutiny, but as a partner in the investigation, a fellow concerned party. One of us, not one of them. Hedging was subtler, but arguably more significant. It appeared in the moments where precision should have come naturally, where the events being discussed were recent enough and personal enough that vague recollection would seem, on reflection, difficult to explain. I think before timeline detail. As far as I recall, before a sequence of events. To my knowledge, before a claim about the children's whereabouts. Each of these qualifiers does something specific. It insulates the speaker from being caught in a direct falsehood. If a phone record or a camera timestamp later contradicts a statement, the hedge creates distance. I didn't say it definitively. I said as far as I recall. Analysts are careful, and the public should be too, to avoid treating hedging as automatic proof of deception. Memory under stress is genuinely imprecise. People hedge when they are afraid of being wrong, not only when they know they are lying, but in an investigative context. The pattern and placement of hedges matters. When they cluster around specific moments, the moments where the timeline of the children's last hours comes into focus, that clustering becomes a data point worth examining. Diversion was the 3rd tactic, and in some ways the most revealing to watch in real time. It appeared when the interviewer asked pointed, specific questions, and Martel responded with something adjacent but different. A long anecdote about a separate topic. A pivot to a detail that wasn't what was asked. A reframing of the question itself before attempting to answer it. These moves don't require conscious strategy. Human beings divert naturally when a question makes them uncomfortable. The instinct to move away from discomfort is almost universal. But in an interview that was already being watched by analysts, investigators, and hundreds of thousands of online viewers, diversion had consequences. It created moments where the original question never received an answer, where the conversation moved on, and the gap was left hanging. None of this, not the ingratiation, not the hedging, not the diversion, constitutes proof of anything. Behavioral analysis is not forensic evidence. It does not belong in a closing argument. It belongs at the beginning of an inquiry, as a map of where to look next, not as the destination itself. Analysts and investigators both know this. The danger is when the public forgets it, when behavioral cues become, in the court of social media, the equivalent of a verdict. What behavioral analysis did in this case was generate questions. Specific, testable, documentable questions. When did the front door last open that night? And does the sensor log confirm what Martel said? Where was his phone between the hours he described being asleep and the moment the alarm was raised? Do the timestamps on any device in that household match the sequence of events he described to the interviewer? These are the questions that objective evidence can answer. And in an investigation with access to phone data, GPS records, and thousands of hours of video tips, those answers exist somewhere in the archive. The interview didn't close the case. It opened new corridors in it. Keep watching. Keep asking questions. And if anything in this case has triggered a memory or an observation you haven't reported yet, do it now. RCMP is still actively investigating. Part 5 is coming, and the most critical details are still ahead. There's a detail in the drunk turkey interview that seemed, on first listen, like a minor procedural point, a small domestic observation buried inside a longer answer. But analysts kept returning to it. Commentators flagged it. And once you understand why it matters, once you understand what it means to the entire sequence of events around the morning Jack and Lily disappeared, it stops feeling minor entirely. It starts feeling like one of the most important claims Daniel Martel made in that entire conversation. The claim was about the front door. Martel asserted, repeatedly and with notable emphasis, that the front door of the trailer could not have been used for an unauthorized exit. He pointed to noise, the sound the door made when opened. He referenced routine, the patterns of the household, the way sounds carried through the space, the likelihood that any movement toward that exit would have been heard by sleeping adults. He cited physical constraints that he suggested made a quiet, undetected departure through that door essentially impossible. And in doing so, he was making an argument, perhaps without fully realizing how testable that argument was, that the children could not simply have walked out on their own in the early morning hours without anyone knowing. On the surface, this sounds like the statement of a man trying to help. If the front door couldn't have been used quietly, then the walked-away theory loses credibility. If the children couldn't have slipped out undetected, then something else must have happened to them, and that something else demands answers, a parent or a step-parent. Making that argument seems, at first glance, to be pushing investigators toward the truth rather than away from it. But here's the problem. Here's the detail that makes this claim so much more complicated than it appears. If the front door could not be used for an undetected exit, then it also could not be used for an undetected entrance. If noise and routine and physical constraints made quiet passage through that door impossible, those constraints applied in both directions. And that means that whatever happened to Jack and Lily that night, whether they left, whether they were taken, whether they were moved, the front door becomes a critical piece of physical evidence that either confirms or destroys the account Martel offered to the public. Investigators know how to test this. They don't take a subject's word for how loud a door is or how easily it moves. They go to the door. They open it under different conditions, different humidity levels, different temperatures, different positions of the hinges. They interview every person who has ever lived in or spent time in that home about what they heard and when. They look for sensor data, for any alarm or motion detection system that logged entries or exits. They pull any surveillance footage from neighboring properties that might have captured movement near that entrance during the relevant window. A door that creaks is a fact. A door that doesn't creak is also a fact. And facts about physical objects do not change based on what a subject says in a media interview. They exist independently, waiting to be measured. What made this particular claim so significant to analysts wasn't just the substance of it, it was the repetition. Martell returned to the door multiple times throughout the interview without being specifically prompted each time. He reinforced the point. He built it into his account as a structural element, something he clearly wanted the audience to accept and carry forward. In behavioral terms, that kind of unprompted reinforcement is worth noting. People emphasize what they need you to believe. And what Martell needed the audience to believe, more than almost anything else in that conversation, was that those children did not walk out through that door on their own. The question investigators had to answer was a simple one with potentially enormous consequences. Was he emphasizing that because it was true, or because it needed to be true? Then there was a theory, the one that the interviewer built toward across the entire episode, and landed with a kind of careful, measured gravity that made it impossible to dismiss and equally impossible to confirm. The accidental death followed by stage concealment hypothesis. The idea that something went wrong inside that trailer, something unintended, something that may not have begun as a crime, and that what followed was not a search for missing children, but a desperate effort to make a tragedy look like a disappearance. This theory has a structure that fits certain patterns in the public record. It can account for the vagueness in the timeline. It can explain the emphasis on the door. It can make sense of the blanket found hanging in a tree nearly a kilometer from where it was supposedly thrown away. It can absorb the chronic welfare concerns, the school absences, the household stressors that have been accumulating long before the morning of the disappearance. In that sense, it is a coherent hypothesis, a plausible model. But plausible is not proven. And in a case involving two missing children, two real human beings whose families are still waiting for answers, the distance between plausible and proven is not a technicality. It is everything. The accidental death and concealment theory is one among several that investigators are required to hold simultaneously. Stranger abduction remains on the table. Deliberate removal by a third party, someone known or unknown to the family, has not been ruled out. Sequences of events that haven't yet entered the public record may exist in the investigative file in ways that shift the entire picture. Investigators are not permitted the luxury of settling on the most compelling narrative. They are required to test every narrative against physical forensics, digital timelines, and corroborated witness statements until one theory survives and the others collapse. That process is still underway, and its outcome cannot be borrowed in advance. The cadaver dogs that swept Martell's property and the surrounding 8.5 square kilometers became another flashpoint in the public conversation. Their deployment was publicized. The absence of sustained positive alert from K-9 units was interpreted by many online commentators as confirmation that no remains were present in the searched areas. That interpretation, while emotionally understandable, is investigatively incomplete. Cadaver dogs are extraordinary tools. They are among the most sensitive detection instruments available to law enforcement, but their effectiveness is not absolute. It is conditional. Timing matters. Biological material degrades and disperses at rates that vary enormously depending on temperature, moisture, soil composition, and exposure. Environmental conditions matter. Wind patterns and rainfall can alter the dispersal scent in ways that make detection unreliable even in areas where remains are present. Contamination matters. When hundreds of volunteers and search personnel move through a zone, they introduce competing scents that can complicate a dog's indication. Handler deployment matters. The route taken, the timing of the search, the conditions on that specific day all affect what a dog can find. The RCMP acknowledged these limitations publicly. Their statements about K-9 deployments were careful and precise for exactly this reason. Investigators combined dog results with forensic soil sampling, geolocation data, aerial imaging, and controlled researches rather than treating a single K-9 sweep as definitive. A dog that didn't alert is not the same as a scene that has nothing to offer. It is a data point, one data point among many, in an investigation that requires all of them to be weighed together. The absence of confirmed finding is not the same as the absence of crime, and the presence of unanswered questions is not the same as guilt. We are getting close to the most important conclusions of this entire analysis. Share this video right now, because Jack and Lily's story deserves every set of eyes it can get. Part 6 is the one that brings it all together. Every missing child case arrives at a moment where the public narrative and the investigative reality begin to pull in different directions. The public needs resolution. It needs a story with a shape, a beginning, a middle, and an answer at the end. The investigation needs something else entirely. It needs patience. It needs precision. It needs the discipline to hold multiple contradictory possibilities open simultaneously until the evidence itself closes them one by one. The case of Jack and Lily has arrived at exactly that tension point, and how we navigate it, how we talk about it, what we demand from it, what we do with the information we have, matters more than most people realize. So let's be honest about where things actually stand. What we know is this: 2 children are missing. An exhaustive physical search across more than 8 square kilometers produced almost nothing. A boot print, a torn blanket, a fragment of evidence that raises more questions than it answers. 6 polygraph examinations were conducted, and all subjects passed. Investigators collected over 740 tips and more than 9,300 video files. As of mid-July, RCMP had not officially classified the case as criminal. Forensic analysis of Lily's blanket was ordered, and the results have not been made public. A high-profile media interview produced a public account from the children's stepfather that contains inconsistencies, hedges, and emphasis patterns that analysts have flagged for follow-up. And somewhere in the investigative archive, in the phone records, the GPS data, the bank transactions, the surveillance footage, the case files held by child protection agencies, there is information that the public has not yet seen. What we do not know is everything else. We do not know what happened to Jack and Lily. We do not know with certainty what took place inside that trailer on the night before they were reported missing. We do not know whether the inconsistencies in Martel's account reflect deception, memory failure, stress, or something else entirely. We do not know what the forensic analysis of the blanket revealed. We do not know whether any of the 9,300 videos or 740 tips contained information that shifted the investigation in a direction the public isn't aware of. We do not know whether the accidental death and concealment theory, the stranger abduction theory, or some other sequence of events entirely is closest to what actually happened. Anyone who tells you otherwise is not being straight with you. But here is what careful, responsible analysis of the public record does allow us to say, and these conclusions matter because they are the difference between commentary that helps and commentary that harms. First, the inconsistencies in Martel's public statements are legitimate investigative leads. They are not proof of guilt. They are not a conviction. But they are precisely the kind of discrepancies that justify investigators returning to the data, re-examining phone logs, rechecking GPS coordinates against stated locations, going back to neighbors with more specific questions, pulling additional footage from cameras that may not have been prioritized in the initial sweep. Inconsistencies in public statements create testable claims. And testable claims are the currency of an investigation. Second, behavioral analysis is a tool for generating questions, not delivering answers. The ingratiation, the hedging, the diversion observed in the drunk turkey interview point toward lines of inquiry. They are signals that say, look here, not conclusions that say we found it. The moment behavioral cues are treated as equivalent to forensic evidence, the moment a pattern of speech becomes, in the public mind, the same as a fingerprint at a crime scene, the analysis has stopped being useful and started being dangerous. Investigators know this distinction. The public needs to know it too. Third, the child welfare history surrounding Jack and Lily is not incidental background noise. It is a material part of the investigative context. Chronic school absences, documented welfare concerns, potential prior agency involvement. These are not details that paint a simple picture of villains and victims. They are indicators of a household operating under sustained pressure, and that pressure has documented consequences for children. Understanding that history requires access to professional records and assessments, not speculation. But the history matters. It belongs in the picture. Fourth, and perhaps most urgently, the most valuable contributions any member of the public can make to this investigation are not theories. They are not behavioral analyses. They are not social media threads connecting circumstantial dots. They are time-stamped, specific, documented observations. An uncompressed video file with intact metadata. A photograph taken at a precise time and location. A first-hand account of something seen or heard on a specific date, at a specific hour, in a specific place. These are the contributions that investigators can actually use, because they can be authenticated, cross-referenced, and measured against the existing evidentiary record. Tips that say, "I think he's guilty," do nothing. Tips that say, "At 4:47 a.m. on this date, my trail camera captured this image at this location," can change everything. The search for Jack and Lily is not over. The investigation is active. Somewhere in a landscape of 9,300 videos and 740 tips and forensic analyses still being processed, there may already be the piece of evidence that breaks this case open. There may be a witness who hasn't yet realized what they saw. There may be a camera recording sitting on a hard drive that someone hasn't thought to check. There may be a detail in a child protection file that connects directly to the morning those two children disappeared. The RCMP has asked for the public's continued assistance. They have asked for patience. They have asked for precision over passion, for verified information over viral speculation. That is not a bureaucratic request. It is an investigative necessity. Because in a case this complex, with this much noise surrounding it, the signal that leads to the truth needs to be protected from the interference of unverified claims and emotional conclusions. Jack and Lily deserve that protection. They deserve an investigation that follows the evidence wherever it leads, without being contaminated by the weight of public judgment before the evidence has been fully examined. They deserve a public that stays engaged, that keeps the pressure on, that keeps sharing information, that keeps the case visible, while also understanding the difference between helping and hurting. Their story isn't over, and neither is the work of finding them. If you have any information, any footage, any observation, any detail, no matter how small, contact RCMP directly. Do not assume someone else has already reported it. Make the call. Share this video so that the people who need to see it do. And subscribe, because we will continue following this case until Jack and Lily come home.